เศรษฐศาสตร์ธรรมศาสตร์นะครับมีความยินดีนะครับต้อนรับทุกท่านเข้านะครับร่วมสัมมนานะครับหัวข้อสัมมนานะครับเดี๋ยวผมขออ่านนิดนึงนะครับก็จะเป็นApec นะครับ and Thailand trends and challenges on the Pacific Rim นะครับอย่างแรกที่ขออธิบายก่อนนิดนึงก็คือว่าเนื่องจากว่าวันนี้วิทยากรสองท่านนะครับท่านหนึ่งจะใช้ภาษาอังกฤษนะครับแล้วอีกท่านหนึ่งก็จะใช้ภาษาไทยนะครับเพราะฉะนั้นเราจะเป็นสัมมนาแบบไบลิงกัวนะครับเราจะมีทั้งภาษาอังกฤษและภาษาไทยผสมกันไปนะครับโดยที่ก็เดี๋ยวพอวิทยากรท่านแรกบรรยายให้เป็นภาษาอังกฤษก่อนนะครับและท่านที่สองเป็นภาษาไทยหลังจากนั้นเนี่ยถึง Q&A เนี่ยนะครับก็ตามแต่ทุกท่านจะสะดวกนะครับจะถามภาษาไทยหรืออังกฤษนะครับก็ได้นะครับแต่ว่าเดี๋ยวทางผมจะช่วยแปลนะครับให้คุณไมเคิลแชปนิกนะครับก็วันนี้เนี่ยนะครับเรามีวิทยากรสองท่านนะครับทั้งสองท่านเนี่ยจะมานะครับเล่าให้พวกเราฟังนะครับเกี่ยวกับการความร่วมมือหนึ่งนะครับที่จริงๆแล้วทุกวันนี้เนี่ยเราอาจจะได้ยินชื่อน้อยลงแต่เมื่อก่อนเนี่ยเราต้องน่าจะได้ยินบ่อยครั้งนะครับก็คือความร่วมมือที่ชื่อว่า Apec นะครับApec คืออะไรนะครับ Apec สำคัญยังไงกับประเทศไทยนะครับคำถามเหล่านี้เนี่ยอาจจะเป็นคำถามที่หลายท่านนะครับยังไม่ได้ทราบนะครับก็วันนี้ก็จะเป็นโอกาสดีที่เราจะได้ทราบนะครับวิทยากรท่านแรกของวันนี้เนี่ยนะครับจะเป็นคุณไมเคิลแชปนิกนะครับ Well, I have to introduce you in English now, right? Okay. So Michael Chapnick is the Apec Secretariat Communications and Public Affairs Director, right? And he's now based in Singapore. He's responsible for communicating Apec's key message, engaging stakeholders, supporting Apec member economies to build awareness and understanding of policies and outcomes. And so Michael is overlooking the Apec activities, communication activities, right? Actually also include public affairs, media outreach, publications, corporate affairs, and online activities. So Michael, you are like the face of Apec, right? You outreach to give all the information about Apec. Okay, right. And the วิทยากรท่านที่สองนะครับจะเป็นอาจารย์สุพัฒน์วัชราไสยนะครับอาจารย์สุพัฒน์ก็เป็นปัจจุบันเป็นผู้อำนวยการนะครับสถาบันความร่วมมือระหว่างประเทศของมหาวิทยาลัยธรรมศาสตร์นะครับอาจารย์สุพัฒน์เองก็เป็นอาจารย์ของคณะเราเนี่ยครับอาจารย์คณะเศรษฐศาสตร์ธรรมศาสตร์นะครับแต่ว่าอาจารย์สุพัฒน์อยู่มานานแล้วตอนนี้ก็มีเป็นผู้เชี่ยวชาญพิเศษใกล้จะเกษียณด้วยนะครับผมอาจารย์สุพัฒน์เป็นผู้เชี่ยวชาญพิเศษเลยนะครับด้านความร่วมมือระหว่างประเทศนะครับก็มีประสบการณ์เป็นที่รู้จักกันในวงกว้างเกี่ยวกับงานวิจัยเรื่องการร่วมมือfree trade นะครับ free trade agreement นะครับ Okay I would suppose we should be ready for the beginning of the seminar so please just welcome Mr. Michael Chapnick.
Don't feel like the face of Apec, really behind the scenes. I'd like to start actually by just asking around the room, who's heard of Apec before you saw the flyer? And in what capacity have you heard about Apec? Had you participated in a meeting or a workshop or read a news article, saw us online?
Apec's been around a long time. It's like they're part of the landscape almost in academia and
Me?
What is your impression? I'm just trying to get a sense.
Well, I thought you were holding the meeting every 2 years or every year, I don't know. Every year, right? And sometimes you came to Bangkok and we welcome you.
That's about it. I'm out of here. Great. So, in my presentation, I'll talk about Apec's mission and background, talk about the economic significance, which I think is really important to this particular group and this faculty. Some of our achievements and success stories over the last 25 years. Give a bit of context in terms of how member economies and hosts have chosen the themes, which are, in my view, balanced against world events, global events and domestic events, which cause hosts to choose those. I'll also talk about some of the trends that we're seeing, and if we have time, I'll get to the APEC priorities for 2015. I have also integrated some video into this presentation. So to start, if you don't mind, let's start with an introductory video. If it, how do I play?
Our world is getting smaller. People, businesses, and economies grow closer together. At APEC, we imagine the possibilities when there is dialogue and cooperation. When diverse communities work together through trade, good things can happen. More choices for consumers, more business opportunities, more jobs, and better standards of living for all. At APEC, we make this a reality by advancing free trade for Asia-Pacific prosperity. Established in 1989 with 12 economies, APEC's membership now totals 21. Recognizing the pace of implementation for differing levels of economic development, APEC leaders in Bogor, Indonesia committed in 1994 to achieve the goal of free and open trade and investment in the Asia-Pacific no later than 2020. This is the fundamental commitment that shapes most of what we do. So how have we set about achieving these goals? Through three broad work areas: trade and investment liberalization, business facilitation, and economic and technical cooperation, also known as APEC's three pillars. The first pillar, trade and investment liberalization, focuses on opening up markets and integrating economies in the region. The second, business facilitation, aims to improve the ease of doing business and reduce trading costs across economies. The third, economic and technical cooperation, enables businesses to take advantage of global trade in a sustainable way. APEC helps the transition towards regional economic integration by ensuring that people are well placed to gain from global trade in the long term. From helping small businesses get loans and access foreign markets, to educating youth in the use of information technology, and empowering women to play a bigger role in APEC economies. A tough challenge, sure, but consider this. There have been significant reductions in average tariffs in APEC over the past 20 years. Trade facilitation, which makes it easier, cheaper, and faster to trade across borders, has also saved businesses billions of dollars with initiatives like simplifying customs procedures and making it quicker for business people to travel with the APEC Business Travel Card. Structural reform makes doing business easier and helps ensure higher quality growth across the APEC region by promoting competition and developing stronger social safety nets. APEC's work on reducing tariffs positively impacts trade and investment and overall development. Over a span of 10 years, the GDP of many APEC economies grew dramatically. Employment increased significantly, and poverty was greatly reduced. Going beyond traditional trade and investment areas, APEC also undertakes work that reflects new regional challenges. Implementing projects that help the region reduce disruptions in the supply chain in the event of a disaster. Developing guidelines and building the capacity of economies and businesses to help them deal with pandemics. And focusing on strengthening energy security to help build a sustainable future. But as the world grows ever smaller and economies grow closer, APEC's role becomes ever greater and more relevant. so that as incomes rise, poverty falls, and the gap between developing and industrialized economies narrows, there really can be progress for all. APEC, advancing free trade for Asia-Pacific prosperity.
So as a good communicator, we believe in repetition and repeating messages. We produced that video maybe 2 or 3 years ago. As I look back, I wonder how we got so much information into 4 minutes. I'm going to take about 30 minutes or 40 minutes to tell you that same information and make sure that you get it. We'll give more detail, and please feel free to ask questions. Do you remember how many member economies APEC has? 21. 21 member economies. We started with 11. We were founded in Canberra, Australia in 1989. Expanded to include China, Hong Kong, China, Chinese Taipei, into Latin America, Mexico, Chile, Peru. In Asia, Vietnam joined in '98 along with Russia, and that was when our last new members had joined. APEC's economic significance is pretty stark. We account for 57% of world GDP, 47% of global trade, and 39% of the population. And I think what's interesting for me, and I don't have a time series graph here, but when I first started giving this presentation 8 years ago, we were at about 52% global GDP, and I think around 47% of global population. So I think there's a story to be told there. Global trade, though, our percentage of global trade has remained about the same, around 47%. Our mission is to build a dynamic and harmonious Asia-Pacific community by championing free and open trade and investment. Like I said, we're made up of 21 member economies. We operate on a non-binding and consensus principles. That means that APEC does not make signed agreements. We don't have an international charter like the UN or other international organizations. Our only agreement is a domestic agreement between the APEC Secretariat and the government of Singapore, which allows the Secretariat to exist. Otherwise, everything is done on a voluntary, non-binding consensus basis. The host economy every year sets priorities, and like Gung Tuan said, we meet once a year. We have about 150 meetings per year. The leaders meeting, which is the one that gets the headlines globally, is once a year, and each year APEC meetings are hosted by a particular member. So this year we're being hosted by the Philippines. Thailand hosted in 2003. And we're an incubator of ideas. At least that's what we like to say about ourselves. We get criticized for the lack of non-binding commitments and taking this consensus approach. But really what it also does is allow space for members to discuss ideas that are a bit more wild than in a binding organization, a bit more, they can explore a bit more, as opposed to negotiating the details that need to be arrived at, and I can explain a bit more of that later. Yeah, like I said, I've been using the term member economies, and you'll hear that throughout this presentation. This is really, I think, probably a political economy type of issue where, as I mentioned, China, Chinese Taipei, and Hong Kong, China participate equally around the table. They're called economies because of that purpose. We're not nations or states or countries. We don't use any terminology related to sovereignty. And you'll see that in our publications, on our website, and even around the meeting table itself. What are our core objectives? They're to develop and strengthen the multilateral trading system. By that, we're extremely supportive of the WTO, of the Doha Development Agenda. I think realistically, there's recognition that that is stuck at this point, and yet we are supportive of the other mechanisms besides the DDA at the WTO. For example, the arbitration mechanisms that are in place there. We see APEC as a way to increase interdependence and prosperity of member economies. And I know this might sound sentimental, but when I was a student studying international relations in 1989, I read a book by Joseph Nye about interdependence. And I sort of wondered what it was and thought, that seems like a cool idea. And just a couple of years ago, I was at a conference in Washington where I was sitting next to Professor Nye and had a chance to tell him how meaningful that book was, and that we're actually doing that. And we're trying to promote sustainable economic growth. And I'll go a bit more into detail about how we're doing that a little bit later. So APEC was formed in 1989, and right now I want to go through a couple of charts. You'll remember the Berlin Wall came down in 1989. Nelson Mandela was released from prison in 1989. The world was changing. Gorbachev introduced glasnost and perestroika in the second half of the 1980s. East Asian tigers had experienced rapid growth, and China was modernizing under Deng Xiaoping. It was in this context that APEC was formed in Canberra when APEC ministers met. And these ministers, meaning the foreign ministers and trade ministers, have been meeting since then every year. When President Clinton was elected in '92, he elevated APEC to the leaders level and held the first leaders meeting in 1993 in the US in Blake Island, Washington. At that same time, the EU was formed in 1993, the European Union. Economic integration was gaining ground. In 1994, the year after the first economic leaders meeting in Bogor, Indonesia, when they met, they established what we call the Bogor Goals of Free and Open Trade and Investment. And that's one of the goals that really underpins most of what we're doing. And in 1995, the WTO was formed to establish the importance of free trade. In the Philippines, President Ramos was elected in 1992 and began implementing economic reforms. He's widely credited with the turnaround in the Philippines during the 1992 to 1996, influencing the Philippines theme in 1996 from vision to action. As an aside, I had a chance to meet President Ramos last year, and I will say publicly that he is probably the smartest, funniest, and strongest people I've ever met. And by that, I mean physically strong. He shook my hand until it almost broke. He's an 86-year-old, and you never complain to an 86-year-old former general, former president, an 86-year-old that he's squeezing your hand too hard. He's sharp and he's really funny. And after speaking to him, I can understand how he made this turnaround. But hopes were dashed after the Philippines year by the Asian financial crisis in 1997. Malaysia and many Southeast Asian economies were affected by currency speculation. As a result of the Asian financial crisis, Malaysia instituted its own response and financial and monetary reforms that helped put its economy back on track the fastest. Hence, Malaysia's theme when they hosted in 1998, strengthening foundations for growth. In fact, and we also recognize that at that time APEC was criticized very much so publicly for not responding to the Asian financial crisis as the time. But in fact, many of the reforms laid the foundation for Malaysia and other Southeast Asian economies to weather the global financial crisis in 2008 and the subsequent recession. And I might add, on the global financial crisis, I think we're really lucky at the APEC Secretariat right now to be led by Dr. Alan Bollard, who is the head of the Federal Reserve Bank of New Zealand and saw the global financial crisis through as a Reserve Bank governor, and also concurrently wrote a book about it called Crisis, which I would encourage you to read. He's also told us privately that if the crisis hit New Zealand more seriously, he probably wouldn't have had time to write the book. So, in 2001, China joined the WTO. China, Hong Kong, China, and Chinese Taipei. And you'll hear me say Chinese Taipei and not Taiwan. You'll hear me say Hong Kong, China, and not Hong Kong, because these are the agreed nomenclature in APEC that we use. In China, in 2001, China joined the WTO. In addition, its state enterprise reforms instituted in 1980 were mostly completed by 2001 and were beginning to have an effect. China was also experiencing strong growth in 2000 to 2001 and went on to experience record growth over the last decade between 2000 and 2010. Hence, its theme in 2001, meeting the new challenges and the new century, was well chosen. International events near the end of this period, which I'm calling expanding the agenda for APEC, were also important and impacted the themes going forward. 9/11 occurred in 2001 in the United States, the Bali bombings in Indonesia, SARS around Southeast Asia influenced the choice of Thailand's theme in 2003, World of Differences, Partnerships for the Future. And I expect that we'll hear more from you, Dr. Supat, about that. In 2004, we experienced the Indian Ocean tsunami. It devastated the region and consequently had an economic impact. Accordingly, one of the priorities for Korea in 2005 was safeguarding human security, counterterrorism, energy security, health, and disaster response and preparedness. 2005, when Korea was hosting, was also a period when we were doing a midterm stock take on how well we were doing, toward how well we were progressing towards meeting the Bogor goals. Vietnam was also enjoying the effects of its Doi Moi, and forgive my pronunciation, Doi Moi economic reforms begun in 1986. They were experiencing rapid growth also during this period, only second to China. But Vietnam was also well aware of the need for sustainable development. The theme they chose in 2006 highlighted the need for the APEC community to be dynamic so as to effectively deal with the challenges of a fast-changing international environment, and took into account that the APEC process is human-oriented and made its year's themes responsive to the UN Millennium Development Goals. In 2008, Peru hosted APEC. We began to see the resurgence of the Asia Pacific around this time. This may have been brought about by decisions by some economies to draw down forces in the Middle East. At the same time, attention was turned toward economic opportunities, largely driven by a need to rebalance the global economy. As Asia began to export more, demand for extractive industries, mining, grew, which therefore drove trade between China, the second largest economy in the world, and places like Australia, Chile, and Peru. In the middle of all this, the world faced a financial crisis, the global financial crisis in 2008, where liquidity dried up. Leaders needed solutions. Singapore, Apec's host for 2009, revised its focus from supply chain connectivity to financial reform, thus giving rise to the Apec growth strategy that emerged in 2010 when Japan hosted. Before this period, leaders always spoke about growth. After 2010, we added 5 adjectives to the word growth. The APEC growth strategy called for balanced, inclusive, secure, and sustainable growth. Nowadays, you rarely... There's a 5th one that I'm missing. Is anyone counting? We'll come back. Nowadays, you rarely hear a leader describing the need for growth without one of those qualifiers. And I urge you, when you're listening to the news, you'll hear those 5 words. As financial institutions grappled with solutions to the crisis, they all recognized that the world cannot continue growth as usual. The U.S. hosted APEC in 2011 and chose green growth as one of its priorities. You'll recall that President Obama was elected in 2008 on a platform that promoted alternative energy and investment to create viable green jobs. Similarly, he was about to run for a second term in 2012, just the year after APEC hosted its meeting and its leaders meeting in November, less than a year before the election. And increasing exports and a pivot to Asia was at the heart of the economic strategy. I put pivot to Asia in quotes. It's likely that this theme, promoting green growth, was chosen because of that election platform. In 2012, APEC delivered on its commitment and finalized a list of 54 environmental goods like solar water heaters and wind turbines that will be subject to a tariff rate of no higher than 5% at the end of this year. I have trouble when I say these words to you because I think 54 environmental goods, that doesn't sound like a lot. 5% lower tariff rate doesn't sound like a lot. But these 54 environmental goods are based on a 6-digit harmonized tariff code. This becomes pretty technical in trade speak. That means it's a classification of many, many more goods. That market's worth $300 billion, okay, just in the Asia Pacific alone. So it's a pretty significant class of goods. Furthermore, and I think this is really important, the WTO has been working on a similar list but hasn't been able to achieve it. But earlier this year, some economies in the WTO announced that they would use APEC as a model to move the issue forward in Geneva. So we're seeing practices being implemented in APEC carried over to other global institutions. Where are we now? We're thinking about innovation. We're thinking about connectivity. Innovation was a key theme for the Russia year in 2012. Connectivity was what we worked on in Indonesia, and I think Indonesia chose this theme for a couple of reasons. They saw an importance for the region to be connected through its supply chain and through its global value chain, but also there was a domestic need to work on connectivity. One, Indonesia is an archipelago of thousands of islands, and they are seeing different prices on different islands across their economy. They were also hosting the WTO at the end of the year, just a month after the APEC meeting, and at that point they delivered the Bali package. Last year in China, APEC leaders announced that they would explore the possibility of realizing a free trade area of the Asia Pacific, otherwise known as FTAP. And you'll hear that acronym, FTAAP, along with many other acronyms in trade. The TPP, you're probably aware of, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There's the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. This diagram, which unfortunately you can't see, shows the many different possibilities of how a free trade area of the Asia Pacific could evolve. And just for your information, I've been using a lot of acronyms, and I'm going to test you at the end of the talk. We have an app on the Apple Store and the Android Store that shows all the APEC glossary, the APEC acronyms. So I urge you to download it. There's a quiz on that app when you're feeling tired. This year, we're working on the terms of reference, how the strategic type study towards identifying a free trade area of the Asia Pacific will lay out. Next year, we'll start implementing that study, and probably by the end of 2016, we'll start to hear more talk about the FTAP and what the possibilities might be. But don't let the task of identifying terms of reference fool you. It's going to be a tough task, I think, negotiating between the member economies of how that study is going to look. So I wanted to stop talking for just a moment and go back to another video. We'll hear from leaders about the evolution of APEC over the last 25 years.
Inaugurate the annual leaders meeting in 1993 was an important and logical step forward for the organisation. The meetings provide the only regular opportunity for the leaders of the most dynamic region of the world, covering some half of global trade, to discuss those issues in an informed and effective environment.
Apec was created to build a region of common and sustained prosperity. In Bhopal in 1994, leaders agreed that we would achieve this objective by advancing free and open trade and investment in our region. We included technical cooperation as an important foundation of the Bhopal Group. In the past 19 years, this landmark commitment has brought us tremendous progress. Today, regional trade and investment have increased significantly. This has contributed to the increase of the Apec Economies GDP, which now account for 54% of the global GDP.
Now, the story of Asia over the last few decades is the story of change that is so rapid and transformative that it may be without precedent in human history. Countries where people once lived on a few dollars a day are now some of the fastest growing economies in the world, with incomes and living standards that few could have imagined 40 or 50 years ago.
APEC は1989年発足以来、およそ四半世紀にわたってアジア太平洋地域の経済成長に重要な役割を担ってまいりました。この間、我々はいくつかの経済的困難に直面しましたが、各エコノミーの努力、相互の連携でこれを克服してきました。
Today, nearly half of global trade takes place in the Asia Pacific, and 56% of the world's GDP comes from it. My own country, the Philippines, is a beneficiary from the more open environment for trade and investments. Economic growth is expected to exceed the initial 6.2% projection, and it will continue next year.
Being a member of the APEC gives a lot of opportunities for companies to engage the Pacific into many of these countries' economies around the world.
Coming from a small country like you, with 57 free trade agreements with countries all over the world, many of them, 9 of them, with an Apec member country, I have to share with you our optimism and our commitment to achieve that goal. Because obtaining a world with a more free and open economy is something that we all know that is good for each and every country in the world.
Historically, APEC was set up to encourage mutual trade and investment. The philosophy of the forum is to lift barriers, encourage openness of markets, encourage fair competition.
We believe that it's been, one of the big factors that's actually lifted so many billions of people out of poverty is that sell various goods and services that sell into each other's markets.
Và tôi tin chắc chắn rằng các nền kinh tế, đặc biệt là các nền kinh tế của những nước đang phát triển cũng phải có những chuyện ngăn cản để cho có được. Vấn đề thứ hai là tôi tin tưởng chắc chắn rằng là bên cạnh những cái tổ chức liên kết ở chúng ta thì có những cái tổ chức liên kết song song tồn tại ví dụ như ASEAN sẽ hình thành cộng đồng và cũng hay lập những các trung tâm của
We are trapped in a false dilemma. The dilemma is either we promote the economic growth or we preserve the environment. And I say that there is no such dilemma because it is possible to achieve sustained economic growth and at the same time to reduce emissions.
In this day and age, to think about growth and development without thinking about sustainability is just not sensible at all. We also have to be mindful of the effects on human health and environmental balance of other aspects of this unsustainable development. Women role models are critical. I think for the generation there are very few role models, and often it is hard for people in the country to even relate to those very few women elsewhere who are in leadership positions. So these days there's many other role models among women, and that does inspire younger women. And the one thing, yes, that could be me.
We will adopt a declaration for the first time in APEC's history that will affirm this organization's and each member economy's commitment to improving women's access to capital and markets, to building women's capacities and skills, and to supporting the rise of women leaders in both the public and private sectors.
It is the economic benefit that people are really looking at. It's 3 meals a day, it's a better home, it's insurance for the kids so that they can finish college. I think this can be some of every family, regardless of nationality around the world. And here again, APEC is in it.
So like I said, you're going to hear repetition. I'm sure you've heard the leaders say what I said, and I hope to continue to repeat that so the message sinks in. Now I want to get into a little bit of some of the trends, what we're seeing. In the past decades, APEC growth has been predominantly trade-driven and predominantly in manufactured and processed goods. We're now seeing some shift to domestic demand growth. Trade patterns are changing as they supply growing consumer demands. There's also a big increase in international trade and services, and this will continue. In fact, the Philippines this year is putting a big focus on services as a way to, open services up in the region, but it's also, as you might know, very important to the Filipino economy as well. It's a domestic issue, which is what I'm saying. We've also seen average tariffs fall in the region between 1989 and 2012 from about 17% in 1989 to just below 6% in 2012. I was saying yesterday at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it's easier when the tariffs are higher to get them to fall faster, but when we get down to that 6% level, progress is a little bit tougher. It's sort of like when you're young, you grow faster, you gain weight faster, you're getting taller faster, but when you get older into your teens, into your 20s and 30s, trust me, you grow less. It's also more difficult to lose weight. But we've also seen behind the border barriers, in addition to tariffs, the tough part about lowering tariffs, behind the border barriers remain, and that's why we're shifting our focus there towards areas like trade facilitation, encouraging the ease of doing business, and the connectivity of people, infrastructure, and institutions. In a study we did to measure our second trade facilitation action plan, we saw that businesses saw a savings of almost $60 billion in a 5-year period as a result of members' economies' actions that they took to ease business demands. We're actually seeing some real tangible achievements. In the past, traditional trade routes were based on the Panama Canal, the Malacca Straits, entrepot ports, meaning import and export ports, were in Hong Kong, Singapore, Shanghai, and Los Angeles. Nowadays, there are many competitive new trade routes opening up, increasing competition and efficiency and decreasing vulnerability. Megaports are being challenged by budget ports and virtual cloud entrepôts, meaning we're seeing digital trade supplant some of the traditional sea-based or air trade, air services trade. This is a complicated chart. You don't have to read it all in detail, but I'll explain it generally. Most products used to be made here, sold there, vertically integrated within large firms. Rules of origin and value added were simple concepts. Nowadays, we see an increase in intermediate goods, intra-industry trade, supply chains which use border transactions more aggressively and help SMEs to globalize. That means that rules of origin and value added are much more complex. You see in this example the iPhone, which is designed in California. Components come from different member economies. It might be assembled in China and then sold obviously throughout the world. It's harder to know where a product is made. Logistics in the past used to consist of traditional transportation, warehousing, shipping, and paperwork. Probably seen that in old movies, most of you. Now, major technological developments are transforming logistics into an embedded, distributed, and high-tech industry. Ancillary financiers, insurance, accounting, business services are changing to accommodate this. Big data, which is a hot topic in Silicon Valley these days, is allowing savings in inventory management and advances in macro forecasting. Traditional ports, airports, land borders, pipelines, and cable terminals used to be heavily policed and covered in red tape. Increasingly, border regulation is being dispersed with single-window, harmonized, contracted operations. Efficient borders are recognized as a source of competitive advantage. Does anyone know what a single window is? Has anyone downloaded the Apec glossary app? The definition is in the glossary app. A single window essentially allows an importer or exporter to go to one window, virtual window, and file all the paperwork in that area, at that desk. Most member economies have agreed to implement this single window system, and about, I think, 15 of 21 have actually implemented it fully. And really, it's a way to save time for importers and exporters at the border. It has long been cheap to import and export capital, but traditionally that has been regulated separately from trade. Now there's some integration of capital and goods flows underway. You may have heard of the SWIFT foreign exchange systems, which is really allowing capital to move a lot more easily than previously. The movement of people has long traditionally been handled separately. Now there's a huge increase in demand for improved mobility for business people, skilled labor, tourists, and students. Lessons from improved goods management are being applied here. Some of you, has anyone heard of the Apec business travel card?
On video.
Sorry?
On video.
On video. Glad you're listening. You can see the Apec business travel card lane in most major airports in the Apec region. It's usually to the far left or far right, where the crew will pass or diplomats will pass. It essentially allows just a faster processing for immigration.
I think I've seen that in Singapore.
Yeah.
The airport, they say like Apec card holders.
Absolutely, and it's here in Thailand as well, in Bangkok. And in fact, I'm from the U.S., and the U.S. recently launched its version of the Apec business travel card, which is sort of not as complete as the other member economies like Thailand, meaning I don't get pre-visa clearance, but I can use the lane more quickly. And I think that's going to be really important when I leave on Sunday, because I know the lanes are pretty crowded.
So how can we get that?
Sorry?
Well, how can we get that card?
How do you get it in Thailand? You apply through that.
You have to apply through the สภานักธุรกิจนะครับขั้นตอนนี้มันค่อนข้างจะใช้เวลาประมาณอย่างน้อย6 ถึง 8 เดือนต้องเป็นนักธุรกิจเป็นเจ้าของธุรกิจและมีหลักฐานว่าทำธุรกิจกับจำเป็นต้องเดินทางไปถึงภาคครับ
The question: How do Americans get that?
Go online to Google Apec business travel card. I think it's administered through the Customs and Border Protection. You fill out an online application for the Apec business travel card and for the global entry, which is the U.S. version of that. You apply for both. It's about $145 US for the application fee. And it's issued. They review your application online. You have to go for an interview. I went for my interview at the American Chamber of Commerce in Singapore. probably have to set it up with Customs and Border Protection at the embassy or when you're back in the U.S. And it was issued to me fairly quickly. I don't think it mattered that I worked for the Apec Secretariat, but I did let them know. But essentially, the card is administered by each individual member economy. The program itself was developed within the APEC Business Mobility Group.
Well, a lot of interesting questions, but yeah, we
Thank you. Sure. That topic also gets quite a bit of interest. I think it's tangible for people. There can be tension between open trade and domestic security. As borders become open, criminal and undesirable movements take advantage. New technologies and international arrangements are helping to limit this. Last year, there was an agreement in China among APEC member economies to cooperate on essentially bringing illegal money back to its own countries. We're now experiencing what I think academics and business people and government officials are saying the new normal. We're seeing that growth is being tempered a bit, especially after the global financial crisis. Employment is growing a lot slower than previously, and so this year APEC has taken on a theme called Building Inclusive Economies, Building a Better World. Remember what I said, inclusive growth, that's one of the adjectives. A study was done by the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council that found that among stakeholders within APEC, just not enough attention was being paid to inclusive growth, and that's one of the reasons why the Philippines chose that theme. There are 4 priorities associated with this year's theme: building regional economic integration, fostering SME participation in regional and global markets, investing in human capital, and building sustainable and resilient communities. If you could indulge me for just a few more minutes, I'll go through each of those fairly quickly. The first theme, enhancing regional economic integration. This is sort of a traditional area for APEC. The initiatives will focus on connectivity and trade facilitation, in particular in areas that promote trade and services and the ease of doing business. You've heard this before during this presentation. Structural reform, financial inclusion measures, and good governance will also be placed high on the agenda to support efforts to build a more inclusive value and production chains in the APEC region. Our second priority supports the entrepreneurial nature of SMEs and their contribution to the overall economic growth. APEC is aligning its capacity building initiatives to the needs of SMEs. APEC continues to support SMEs through trade facilitation measures to link SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, to GBCs, APEC Austria, the global value chain, and to promote full participation in markets by removing barriers to entry and promoting greater access to finance, technology, training programs, and tools. Thirdly, we're investing in human capital development. We're recognizing that economic growth is anchored on the quality of its human resources. APEC continues to pursue the long-term goal of a skilled and adaptable APEC community through cross-border education, science and technology-based education and skills development, and innovation-driven economic and technical capacity building programs. APEC's human capital development initiatives will be designed to foster economic competitiveness coupled with quality and opportunity. And lastly, given the changing global environment and disasters such as typhoons, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and health pandemics, remember the APEC region from South America to Asia, North Asia and Southeast Asia, to Australasia, is located on the Pacific Rim, and we're susceptible to these disasters. APEC is prioritizing the twin goals of resilience and sustainability, along with food security, an area that Tanawa is an expert in the APEC level. APEC looks to create and promote risk reduction and management, build SME resilience to disaster and ensure business continuity. And this builds on what we already have in place, meaning the best practices that have been put in place for businesses and governments to share to build their capacity. So what does this mean? We need to address current and emerging structural reform issues. We're looking to build an economy that's oriented towards inclusive growth. These policies and reforms to lead to even more competitiveness in the APEC region. So with that, I want to say thank you to you, Dr. Supat and Kumtorn and Thammasat University, especially you, the students who on Friday afternoon stayed to listen to me talk about APEC. And thanks also to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for helping to facilitate this visit. I hope that you can follow us on social media, download the apps, follow us on Facebook and Twitter. You'll find more information there. Thank you very much.